if we have a system that's just cultivating people to be cogs in the machine and not having people think more dynamically and globally about themselves in relation to the world and values and whatnot, which can only really come from the humanities, from the arts, then we're setting up an entire system that's just going to continually cause crises.
Welcome to the Explorations Podcast, conversations about life, philosophy, the arts, and more. I'm Luis Hernandez, and I'm joined by my fellow co-hosts, Edwin and Joe. Fellas, how are you guys doing today?
Doing good, feeling great.
Doing good.
Got my latte. I'm ready to rock and roll.
Today, our conversation is about education and ignorance, the dichotomy between the two, and we're going to take a look at education from all sorts of angles. I'm really looking forward to talking to you guys about this particular topic. To start us off, Edwin, I wanted to propose a very simple question to kind of anchor this conversation, but I want you to just, from your experience, to define education. Last week, we had a great conversation about the life well lived, and you set us down a great pathway of just talking about knowledge, the importance of knowledge and utilizing knowledge as a tool to empower ourselves. I guess for me, to just start off why this conversation about education, my experiences with my nieces and nephews during the pandemic and seeing remote learning, it was a terrible experience, like just watching them kind of engage in this remote learning experience. That has made me think really hard about education, about the future generation. And so, Edwin, can you just start us off? Like, what is education from the context of the future generation and for lifelong learners? Why is this important? Why should we be taking a step back and talking about education?
Yeah, this is a great question, Luis. And I'm going to define it in two ways, really. We'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on this. Recently, give credit to Zach Stein, who's done a lot of work around this, where he defines education as the intergenerational transmission of knowledge, right? And what that means is we don't really see it this way because we're in the midst of it. What that means is for you to sustain a society, you always hear the phrase standing on the shoulders of giants, right? For you to progress, if you believe in that term, you need to be able to transfer the knowledge that you currently have in place to the next generation so that generation could build on it. So I almost see it as a dialogue in time, right? So education is the way that we speak to our ancestors about what has been and what should be. It's the way values are transmitted. It's the way information is transmitted. It's what makes us human in a lot of ways, right? It's like it's our soul. Everyone has seen the movie or cartoon Tarzan, right? If you grow up in the jungle without society as a human being, what are you left with, right? You have no language, you lose tens of thousands of years of knowledge that has been built. Education from that perspective is the way we have the future generation continue this quest of progress. I take this very, very seriously, right? To me, education is everything. And then the second way I would define it is as a distinction from propaganda. And that's another of Stein's work. And we see propaganda happening today, but education versus propaganda, right? Because in a lot of ways, information is being flowed to influence, right? Joe can speak better to this, but education is about the truth, right? So if I'm a teacher and I'm an educator and you're my student, my goal is for you to know everything I know and more, right? And propaganda, right, or marketing, whatever you want to call it, is the opposite. I want to maintain the power dynamic. So my goal there is for you to actually not know much. You just need to take on the information that I give you. It's about control. So that's another way of thinking about it. I would love to, especially when it comes to truth, love to get Joe's thoughts on some of that as well.
No, yeah. It's fascinating because in your description, Edwin, particularly towards the latter end of that description, in relation or teasing out the relation between power and truth, I can't help but think of the postmodern philosopher Michel Foucault, the French thinker who made such a splash back in the 60s and the 70s. You couldn't go to a bookstore in Paris without seeing his very unique face, his bald head, the very well-known debate between him and Chomsky and others. Tabling that just for a moment, the reason why I think of him is because he speaks of truth in relation to power and how truth is in fact a form of power, notwithstanding some of his own critiques and whether or not they're viable in light of certain philosophical traditions. I think it is something to consider. And in fact, when we think of education and we're thinking about something like propaganda, we need to, in fact, pause, I think, or slow down a bit and think about the philosophical assumptions that underpin even our definitions, whether or not we are cognizant of how these words are being used and whatnot. So, for example, when we hear the word propaganda, as it is construed as the sort of just receive and digest what I'm saying, take it as truth, and that's it. And that definitely could be construed as a form of propaganda, ideologically driven, maybe. But we would also need to think about, okay, but what is truth, right? And whatnot. Again, the reason why I'm like smiling and smirking, because I hear many of the philosophers in my mind right now wanting to say something about that, and the theologians to speak of it. But I'm a fan of Thomas Aquinas. I'm a fan of the classical philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. And so, truth, I take it, is the mind's ability to be conformed to reality, the mind's conforming to reality, to what is. Truth is that which corresponds to being as such. So, very quick and clear example. If I ask you, Lewis, where do you live? And Lewis is like, yeah, I live in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. I'm like, bro, are you lying to me? Are you lying to me? What I mean by that is what you're articulating doesn't resonate with what is, right? That's a lie. And so if we think about the conversion of that, or the converse of that rather, truth then is what corresponds to reality, to being. I think it's beautiful to reflect on that in light of education, because then that positions us to think about, okay, what is the role of the educator? What is the dynamism in which we need to reflect on as we think about the relationship between the educator and the students, right? The transmission of knowledge, the intergenerational transmission of knowledge, which again, this is by way of providence. I see Edwine's beautiful daughter in the background. Hey, Grace. She can't hear me. She can't hear me. I know, probably. But it's intergenerational, and like, boom, there she is.
Yep.
There's much to be said about that.
My first question, just hearing what you both kind of shared, is to what extent is it like the what you know more important than like how you know? Because you guys are also describing the way in which one educates themselves, right? Like the method. But then there's also the importance of the what, the things themselves, the facts that is important to know. In your example about like, where do I live? It's from what you knew. Like, that I don't live in Brooklyn. And so therefore, like, if you didn't know that, or like to the average listener, they didn't understand, like, wait, like, I didn't know that he doesn't live in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. So my question is, what's the relationship between the what you know and the how you know? And is there, like, as an educator, from an educator's perspective, is there an emphasis? Is one more important than the other? What's the relationship between the two? Because I feel like some systems or schools of thought may place an emphasis in one direction or the other, that it's more important to just know facts versus it's more important to kind of learn the skills and the ability to learn.
I struggle with this one, right? Because sort of quick mini history on education. Our current educational system is built on the framework that was instituted in Germany, right? And some people know this, but the reason that Germany constructed this sort of, or at least K-12 university system that we have today, and this is different from, Joe can speak more to the left, like university as a formation out of theologians and so on during a time, but the K-12 system as we have, like going from one grade to another and so on, is a German invention. And they did it after the soldiers on the field, who were very, very educated, right? When Germany had some of the most educated people in the world. And they would be on the battlefield and they would contemplate either death or the right or wrong of what was happening. And they would flee. There's nothing honorable about what I'm doing, because as I think about this is wrong, right? So what they said was that this was dangerous to have an entire army of philosophers, right? And so what they did is say, we want our soldiers to know the things we want them to know. So the K-12 institution was developed as a way to control minds, right?
Fascinating.
So it's like, we just need them to know math. We just need them to know science. We need them to know the things that we need them to know. Now, what happens with the military is that, military and corporations were tightly entangled in the past, right? We know this, right? In terms of even the founder of the United States, the Mayflower and so on, all the conquest that was happening, these were corporations, right? And what we have today is that corporations are the things that we prepare our minds for, whatever organization, right? So we are now saying the same things. It's not the military per se, but we're saying we need to prepare our minds so they have the skills to do this type of job in the future, right? And that's the way we think of education. And I struggle with that, right? Especially knowing the historical context of our K-12 system. And to the point Joe was making around truth, you can be truthful, right? You can give facts and still, quote unquote, be providing propaganda, because a partial truth is a form of propaganda. By the way, this is not like a bunch of evil people sitting in the back scene saying these things, saying this is what we're going to do. All we're doing is perpetuating the system that has been given to us, right? I say that as a sort of left field. We just need to be careful about how we actually understand the purpose of education today. Going back to the fact that we're transmitting values, we're transmitting information and so on to the next generation to prepare for something. And what that something is, in my opinion, should be a life well lived. This is why we have this podcast. So I would measure all things when it comes to education against that. When we start ticking off like, oh, should we have computer skills and blah, 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 I start to get a little anxious about saying things like that, because which goal do you have in mind when it comes to education?
I love that, Edwin, because you're giving a teleological perspective of education. What that simply means, and that phrase itself has its Greek origins in Aristotle, is that you're saying, as we think of education, we ought to think of the particular goal, the end, and we need to keep the end in mind. And somehow that end ought to shape and inform how we approach it, right? If education is for the cultivation of a life well lived, then that should deeply shape the pedagogical approach, the how we teach, as well as what we teach, right? The truths and the relation of truths to other truths and whatnot. And so I think there's something deeply informative around that. Now, Lewis, when I hear you ask the question, what is that relationship between the what and the how? And we could even think of the why. It's interesting because Edwin, in a certain sense, brought in the why, right? Especially talking about the end goal here. I can't help but think of Plato's Allegory of the Cave, right? Paradigmatic for a certain view of education. You could find that, by the way, that allegory in his work, The Republic, right? Classical piece of literature. Let me walk us very quickly through this allegory. And just as a reminder, an allegory, right, is essentially a story of which the pieces, all the elements within the story have metaphorical significance, right? So they're pointing to something deeper than what the story itself is articulating, or rather, it has existential import. It could be applied to life. So it's a picture of something. Essentially, the allegory of the cave goes something like this. Imagine a cave in where there are folks who are imprisoned, they're chained, and they're chained down in such a way where they are only able to see the wall that is before them. And they are in this situation for so long that they don't even know anything else besides what they are perceiving in front of them. So you can think of this as them being born into kind of bondage, born into a slavery, or the deep darkness of ignorance that has decisively removed any other possible awareness of things, right? Imagine we have these prisoners, they're looking at the wall, they see shadows on the wall, and they think this is reality. Their knowledge, their awareness is landlocked to what is phenomenologically presented before them, right? These images. And this is it. This is life for them. One day, one of these prisoners, just one of the prisoners, is set free. For the first time ever, he's able to kind of stand up and look around and sees behind him the source of light, the fire, and people, the puppeteers, people projecting these things. And He's in complete shock and dismay, right? Because hitherto he thought reality was just right, the shadows on the wall. He's now seeing the source. This is interesting because now his eyes are hurting, right? Because his eyes have not grown accustomed to the source of light being directly ingested. This is where we get the phrase, the truth hurts. The story goes on. He meanders his way outside of the cave. He didn't know he was in a cave the entire time. And for the first time ever, as he exits the cave, he sees the sun, the blue skies, the green grass, flowing water. And he's just completely, again, in shock, in disbelief. He thinks he's died. He can't compute. He slowly comes to awareness and recognizes, my goodness, the entire time I was locked away in ignorance. And this is how it ends, where this individual now wants to go back into the cave to let the other prisoners know that they're enslaved, that they're not seeing reality as such, but are only being deceived, as it were, or seeing a small part of it. However, he gets to a point where he's unable to reach the prisoners, and so he's shouting to them, but to the prisoners, they just see a grotesque shadow projected on the wall that's shouting to them, yo, you guys are being deceived. And Plato, the author of this, says if the prisoners had the capacity to, at this moment, if they were set free, the first thing they would do is kill that person because they think he's out of his mind. He's completely off his rocker. Now, this is Plato, in one sense, taking off his hat, tipping his hat to his great master and teacher, Socrates, who was killed by the machine state of Athens for being a philosopher, right? But for Plato, this entire allegory is representing, as it were, the power of education, right? And for Plato, education is the conversion of the soul, the essential self, the real you, the intellectus, if you want to read it in a certain way, from the darkness of ignorance to the light of truth. And if we read carefully that allegory, we see education then is going to bring about a series of shock, fear, disbelief, a natural reaction like, nah, that can't be the truth, right? And a slow bringing about of the truth. And it's painful, but there's something liberating around that. Now, there's much more to say about the allegory, but what that tells us is two things. Number one, truth is being able to see beyond mere sight. That's not the definition of truth, but rather the apprehension of truth, right? Coming to know the truth requires the mind to perceive more than what the empirical senses are just telling us. And I'll give a small example of this in just a second. And the way truth is communicated is risk-taking, because the person who's now been in the intelligible world of the forms has to now risk himself to go back into the cave to communicate it to others. And it says something about a teacher. The teacher is risking her or his life, as it were, maybe even like in a visceral, literal way, but maybe in other ways as well, just to share the truth. And that's going to be a very difficult thing, right, for those who are taking it in. So the how says something about a kind of move that requires a sort of humility, sort of a practicality, or we need to be sensitive about how we are communicating this truth and whatnot. So this idea that education is the conversion of the soul, if you will, from the darkness of ignorance to the light of truth, I think is deeply paradigmatic for how we can think about education. Again, there's much more to say about that, but
yeah. My takeaway from this conversation so far, I think there's heavy emphasis should be placed, in my opinion, on the critical thinking skills required to kind of break free from the chains, as you put it in Allegory of the Cave. We also talked about propaganda and marketing. And then when you started talking about the Allegory of the Cave, Joe, I keep thinking about cinema and like in video, like that experience of sitting and looking at the wall and like, this is what you see, and kind of getting lost in the wall, like in the frame. I think about video. And when I also think about propaganda, I also think about video, like it's like a major medium of communication. And I think in the role of education, video plays a big part with propaganda and marketing and stuff. Video plays a really big part in those things.
it really does. Louis, let me just jump in for a second, because when you were saying that, what came to mind is what we were talking about in our previous episode, and how you mentioned how editing is a kind of form of lying or deceiving, and how we can actually think of it maybe not just in a purely negative sense of deception, but a way of curtailing and thus creating further space to communicate the truth. And so let's say from a cinematic perspective, cinema, movies, the arts whatever medium is used can be a powerful vehicle, as you are, I think, noting right now, to communicate and to educate. It doesn't have to be the case that cinema de facto or the art de facto is just read on literalistically to, let's say, the cave as just the shadows. Because the shadows, if we want to run with the example that you're saying, could in fact point to the outside of the world through hints, through illusions, through some sort of these kinds of fascinating moves, you know?
Yeah. To me, that's like a representation of like an abstraction.
Yeah.
Because the artist can't show reality. You know, like a painting, it's depicting something, but it's not the thing that it's depicting. Like it's always going to have that abstraction in between. So like even in your allegory, the person comes back. It's not like in your example, the person's like showing themselves. They're also trying to create the puppets, and they're also trying to like utilize the medium, the space around them to like communicate the truth that they saw, because they can't bring the outside world into the cave. In your example, that's how I'm imagining it. They're talking about the truth, but they can't bring the truth itself.
Yes. Can I just give like one salient example of how this weird allegory can be mapped onto kind of the power of education? Let me just see if I can do this. You know, let's say we took a trip to downtown Manhattan and we stood before the World Trade Center. We stood before Freedom Tower. And I asked the both of you, guys, what do you see? Tell me, describe to me what you see, right? And what do you feel, right? What is it generating? And you'll be able to do that, right? You'll say, oh, yeah, it's yay tall. It looks like it's made with these materials. These are the kind of feelings that I have, especially knowing the history of it, and so on and so forth. But if someone is now brought into our little communion, our little community of looking at the Freedom Tower of the World Trade Center, this person is now trained. We don't know, but this person is actually educated in the field of architecture. Right. And architects are really good at understanding the relationship between form and function. They've done their homework. Right. And I asked the architect, what is it that you see? It's fascinating. The architect sees beyond sight, using that intentionally, right? As if the architect has like X-ray vision. Think of Superman here, right? How is it afforded to them that they have this capacity? They've been educated. Their souls are able to actually go beyond what just merely appears, as important as that is, and recognizing that by virtue of its appearance, it must go this depth, right? This much into the ground. If it's this high, if it's made of this material, then they know the internal structure must be comported in such a way. They're understanding the forces, the tensor, right? All of those things. And they're able to articulate that. And we're like, wow, how is it that you're able to see that? Because they've been educated. And this is why Plato will speak of education in this sort of positive dynamic terms that, my goodness, it gives us the ability to be free and grants us a greater capacity for joy, which is interesting because when I share this with my students, they're like, wow, I didn't think of it like that. And I say, but think about it, right? If we all, to use another example, if we're all sitting down watching a football game and none of us know what football is about, we may be able to enjoy it, but the one who knows what it takes, the kind of athleticism, the little bit of the statistics and things like that, they have, by virtue of their awareness, are able to have a greater degree of elation, right? It's like we see a Hail Mary play, right? 50 yards, they launch the ball. The brother caught it, does a flip, all these things. It's like, oh my gosh, that was amazing. But the one who's studied this and who understands what is needed in order to do those actions, they may say to the rest of the viewers, bro, I know you're excited, but you actually don't even know what you just saw. Like what you just saw was insane. I know you don't know it. And so this is why Plato will say, no. Education grants us a deeper capacity for joy, for happiness. And I think this goes back to Edwine's point about a life well lived and thinking about, well, what is education for? And how do we think about that in relation to such and such?
Great example. I'm going to propose this question to you guys based on our conversation. If that is how we define truth in education, then what does it look like for someone, whether it's someone in the K through 12, right? Like a child or an adult, what does it look for someone to have a good education, to kind of embark on a journey of education that is fruitful for a life well lived? What are some signs or things that we should be seeing pursuing that path of a good education?
I can jump in on that one. It's weird because the first thing that came to mind when you asked that question was ignorance. Some of the most educated people I know is able to see ignorance in themselves, right? And our society has gotten complex enough that it's impossible for you to have a truly Renaissance person. We cannot know everything. There's more information in our world now than the capacity of even groups of people to understand. They spent their entire lifetime dedicated to understanding one or two things. And this is why when it comes to things like building rockets or building organizations, whatever it is, these complexities are such that you need hundreds, if not thousands of people dedicated to become specialists in one particular area. So an educated person in this world is one that sees ignorance all around them, and they're always asking questions. From that perspective, it's a continuous process, right? It's a habit almost. It's a mindset. And you look for signs of those habits, right? Is someone saying, how are they educating themselves? What are they picking up? I think we all know this, but education does not end when you leave school. That institution is quickly becoming obsolete. Most of our education nowadays is happening in different ways. And one of the most important ways is this. In fact, Joe and I had this amazing conversation years ago about the structure of dialogue. What does dialogue truly mean? This is how you're educated, right? Someone who's hungry to engage in dialogue. It has very deep philosophical roots. So that's what I would say.
Man, I mean, your description, Edwin, is essentially the mission statement of Socrates, right? His famous statement, I know that I'm the wisest person in the world precisely because I know and take ownership of that I know nothing. So what Socrates is offering us here is that the root of wisdom, the root of awareness is situated in a humble estimation of one's own awareness, right? Of one's own knowledge, right? Wisdom begins in the awareness of what one does not know. And so that's the reason why Socrates would position himself as a questioner and as a dialogue partner, right? We even have a certain form of questioning that's named after him called the Socratic method, right? It is not by accident that his own student, he had many pupils and youth that were following him. One of the more prominent one, Aristocles, we know him as Plato. It's not by accident that Plato, years later, starts his own school. In many ways, the university can trace its origins even beyond the Middle Ages and what the theologians were doing there and the philosophers, all the way back 2,500 years ago to Plato's academy. And which is why any institution of learning we call the academy, right? It's an academy or academia. So, yeah, I mean, dude, without a doubt, right? Questioning, recognizing what we don't know, to your point that who can be a Renaissance man, who can be a Renaissance woman right now, given the plethora of knowledge and information, right? So we then need to think about how do we systematize knowledge? How do we comport ourselves? What are the attitudes of the heart and of the mind, the proper dispositions that are needed? And I think these are important questions. I'm thinking about this for my own self too, right? From a place of vulnerability is like, okay, well, I teach, I do a few other things, but how am I doing in terms of my own learning? What are the habits of mind and heart that I possess that may get in the way of continuing to learn, right? Versus positioning me to, in fact, grow in that. I think that's something that we need to explore a bit more, the habits of the mind, the habits of the heart in relation to truth and ignorance.
I have a question about the role of the other in one's quest for education, because let's say I'm pursuing a particular subject or topic on my own and I'm arriving at false information, but I don't realize it. So whether it's an ally or even just a stranger on the street, what is the role of the other as like a factor or a resource in one's own education? Is it a necessary ingredient, or can you guys kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
I'll say something, and then I definitely want to hear also your own thoughts about that, Louis, because as a one who's in the arts, as you are, I think there's much to say about the other, right? Because I'll let you explore that. My mind is naturally running with some of that stuff there. I'll just say this: wisdom begins also with the awareness of what is. And so, look, we have two eyes, we have two ears, we have one mouth. there's an inherent logic I think we can discern just from the anatomical framework of our being, right? If I have two ears and one mouth, I should listen twice as much than I speak, which I'm probably modeling poorly in this podcast right now. But that is to say, right, I need the other. I need others to help shape and inform my own thinking, right? The book of Proverbs in the Bible, right? Iron sharpens iron. And to the degree in which I begin to think of knowledge acquisition as a kind of isolated solipsistic phenomenon is to the degree in which I'm going to continually grow in a bad way in ignorance, right? So I need others. I really need others. And I think my very body, my being kind of points to that.
Can we go down that trail?
Sure.
How would learning in isolation lead to more ignorance? I'm curious about that.
I think in one sense, because we naturally, and I have certain theological and metaphysical commitments behind this position that I'm about to articulate, but I think it's because we're naturally fallen. We're prone to self-deception in a lot of ways. And so if I don't have recourse to others, even if the others are coming to me through books, right? It's like, I don't need, I'll just figure it out on my own. I may be able to discern certain truths out there and within me, but it's always going to be limited. And that's a dangerous thing. Not that limits are dangerous, but that, as Edwine was pointing to earlier, what I'm able to discern may just be partial truths, right? And I can make an idol out of that partial truth. I may think, oh, what I discovered, and then kind of like exalt that, yeah, this is what it is, right? And I don't allow myself or my thinking to be challenged or even possibly critiqued. So those are some ways in which I think that can happen.
I want to throw this back to you, Lewis, because one way that I interpret what Joe just said is in creativity and innovation. I don't think that's possible. It's very, very limited. Creativity in itself is very, very limited when you don't have an other. An other can come in the form of, again, dialogue or books, right? You know, a book is the voice of the other person in a lot of ways. When you're in this creative or artistic mode, I think a lot of people think that it just comes from internally from your mind. But what I found when I'm most creative is when I'm actually observing others' arts and being inspired in ways by having these sort of dialogues, whether it's visual, whatever, you know, with the other. And I'm not even sure, right? And that's why I wanted to pose a question to you. I'm not even sure if you can, like, our most creative or innovative sort of art or whatever you want to call it. I don't know if that's possible without you observing and sort of engaging in others' art. Is that true? I mean, what's your thoughts there?
Personally, I think it's a necessary condition to the artistic experience to have the viewer or the listener, the person kind of receiving the art. A work of art can only be a work of art when it's seen by like another. Just in the sense that ultimately, if I'm creating something and it doesn't get seen, I would submit that it's like, it wouldn't be considered of artistic value, just in the sense that,
Wow.
yeah, like it can't be received. The whole a tree falls in the forest, I think really does apply to art.
Mm.
And the irony is, like, as an artist, like it's torturing to create the art in a type of isolation. Like most art forms, even with video, like recently, like a lot of like freelance filmmakers and videographers, part of the process is done in isolation, like just necessarily. When I'm editing and stuff, like thankfully there isn't someone just kind of sitting there having to watch me like organize the clips and do like the painful process of laying it out and stuff. But even if I was like a hermit, if this thing that I'm creating, I would want another person other than me to see the completed work, to experience that transfer of value that you guys have like so eloquently have been discussing. Yeah, so I think it's like a necessary condition to have the viewer involved in that whole process of art. Because I think art is a type of education in some form or way. It's educating something.
My goodness, that is a super sexy idea. It really is.
Yeah.
Because my mind naturally then goes to this idea that, my goodness, art is so deeply embedded in the anthropos, in the human being as such, right? It's like it's part of our native tongue. Why? Why am I saying that? Why do I think that? Why is my mind naturally going there? Because if art requires the artist and the observer, right? Two subjects. That seems to be a beautiful extension to the human being, right? That the human being needs others, right? None of us are an island unto ourselves in so many different ways. Also, what comes to mind is the philosopher George Berkeley, notwithstanding his own metaphysical, his idealism that he's articulating, but he famously said, right, to be is to be perceived. And what you're saying here is that art is ever only art to the extent in which it is able to be viewed or engaged or experienced. And again, I see that as an extension to the human being, right? And it's interesting to think about that, dude, in relation to education. But Edwin, it looked like you wanted to share something too.
I just wanted to make a point here. As the both of you were saying, especially as you were talking about that, Louis, I wanted the audience to know that the model that I was placed on what you were saying is one of a creator, right? Everyone thinks art and they start to like bucket it into, oh, it's the things that we do with paintbrushes and whatever. Art is an analogy for creation. So everything you were saying, I was using that as a model for art as the creation of man, art as the things that we do to create other things, right? The architecture that Joe was talking about, right? The architect is understanding that because he's a creator in a lot of ways. So creation is what you were saying, right? If you just want to replace the word art with creation, right? So I want folks to go back and listen to what you said and replace art with creation.
Very
because
interesting.
It was very not only inspiring, but informative to hear you say that.
Yeah.
But wait a minute, Edwin, I mean, you work in the field of education, right? So I want to ask you, and maybe you can speak a bit to what you do here in your response, but why then are so many institutions moving contra this awareness of the importance of arts, right? That the arts and the humanities continue to be dropped away. We need the STEM, right? We need the sciences and the engineering, and not to downplay that, of course. But if art is this dynamo that allows for a creativity and the expression of the self and seems to be so much more embedded in that, what's going on in the world of education from the top down, from the administrative perspective?
Wow, it's a loaded question. There's so much there. A lot of what I do currently is investments into different school models. And I deeply, deeply believe in the experimental process that a lot of schools are going through. And when they have the flexibility to do those things and learn from that process. So I'm currently involved in the investments in some of those different school models, and I think they're very important. Interestingly enough, the most effective schools are those who've actually figured out how to reintegrate the arts and humanities. So there are isolated, whether charter schools and so on, isolated schools that are actually doing that work, and their math and literacy score, which is what we measure them on, is through the roof, right?
Interesting.
So there's something there, right, that we've missed, right? One of the best school I know, for example, because music is a form of art as well.
Yes, it is.
Some of the best music program, right? And so on, right? And you can see that correlation. So I think part of the problem is that schools are now institutions that are being tailored to the organizations that currently control our societies, which is large corporations, right? Every time we talk about schools, we talk about, are they prepared to do X? And what are the incentives for that, right? Because we pay a premium to those who study the skills necessary to make a profit. I'm not going to go into the critique of capitalism or anything like that, but the reality is that we currently are optimized around this pursuit to build an expansion of these sort of corporations, organizations, and so on, right? And funny enough, Joe, when you said that, one of the most alarming concerns right now around the younger generation is that there's always this dichotomy, right? And it was a great article on this dichotomy between I go into being educated so I could build wealth. I go into being educated so I can help people, right?
Yes.
You always say, should I be a psychologist, a sociologist, or should I, just get a JD and become a lawyer? And everyone goes through that trade-off. And there's an alarming rate of people choosing the wealth. And what they're saying to themselves is, once I've done the wealth, because I think everyone, fundamentally want to do good for the world. they say to themselves is, once I get the wealth, then I'll go back and I'll help people, right? And that's happening in an alarming rate. This almost disengagement with civics is what that article was talking about. So you could see that part of the rationale around that is, again, this optimization of schools that says art is not as important. We just need you to get these skills. And what that creates is this common phrase of cogs in a wheel, individuals who can actually do a particular type of work or understand a particular type of thing so they could fit into the system so that they can perpetuate this machine that we call corporations.
And that's going to foster all kinds of negative fallouts, right? Viktor Frankl's work in logotherapy, Man's Search for Meaning, that classic book. And when he speaks of so much of the ailments that many folks are experiencing, ailments of the soul and of the psyche, can be traced back to a kind of existential void, this embedded nihilism that perhaps they're not even aware, right, that they're doing it, but they're living in such a way where there's a lack of meaning. And then they turn naturally to the pursuit of power or pleasure, thinking that those things, by increasing that that'll somehow solve things internally, but it doesn't, right? And so if we have a system that's just cultivating people to be cogs in the machine and not having people think more dynamically and globally about themselves in relation to the world and values and whatnot, which can only really come from the humanities, from the arts, then we're setting up an entire system that's just going to continually cause crises all the way down to each individual.
This is Zach Stein's point, was what you just said, Joe, is that we're actually currently in the midst of an educational crisis. And there's symptoms of that, specifically when we talk about this nihilistic perspective around what is truth anyways, and is it even helpful?
Yeah.
Well, you're in an educational crisis when people start to challenge truth, right? It's like, do I even need to know the truth? What's the point, right? And that's because they're finding meaning in other things.
Yeah.
I have a question about putting our conversation in the context of the pandemic. The pandemic kind of shook up the education system here in the United States and around the world. But I also think what you guys are just sharing now about the different pursuits that people seem to be taking, in my perspective, those pursuits seem to be amplified during the pandemic. Is there a silver lining to the education infrastructure being shaken up, like for things kind of going through such an enormous change during the pandemic? Like, can you guys speak into education ignorance within that context? Are you hopeful about the future in that context and things being shaken up, or is there a different perspective that you have on education ignorance in light of the pandemic?
The pandemic accelerated a lot of things. In economics, there's this term being thrown around, and I think it's fits, which is that we're in the midst of a polycrisis. We're used to sort of single type crises, right? 2008 housing crisis, right? Caused so on. The pandemic, it was like, oh, it's COVID, COVID crisis. But what the pandemic then did was perpetuated an economic crisis and this educational crisis. Now we're talking about like a global climate crisis. We have crises on top of each other. And one of the points that has been made is that an educational crisis is a symptom of societal change moving at a pace much faster than our ability to actually educate our populace, right? So if you look at ignorance as the difference between all that is out there and our understanding of it, that gap has been increasing. So we're becoming more ignorant. I think a lot of people think that, oh, I know more than a medieval man does, right? But they didn't have the technology. They didn't deal with the complexities and crises that we currently are dealing with. Right. So I think ignorance can only be measured in a relative term. And I think from the perspective of that gap, we are much more ignorant than the medieval man. And we have a problem, right? Or a caveman is probably even better, right? Because all they needed to do was eat. They weren't dealing with the type of crisis we were dealing with.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So in that context, they're much better off. Because I don't know how to feed myself without the economic structures that are currently in place. Right? It'll be hard for me to chase down, even a chicken, let alone like, whatever they were chasing. So COVID has shown us is that the world is moving at a much faster pace than we ever imagined, and that we need to change our educational system to fit that. We're failing horribly right now. If you ask anyone that knows organizations, educational systems are the slowest when it comes to the pace of change. But what I'm seeing now, right, because this is what COVID did to it, forced us, it was a forcing mechanism, right? I knew a slew of teachers that couldn't communicate or teach, online, and we just had to do it. Like overnight, boom, teach overnight, right? And everyone was forced into it. And that's what I'm optimistic about, is that there's a sense of urgency that is acting as a forcing mechanism towards innovation in this space. And I think it'll happen very quickly, very soon.
For me, the great difficulty with the pandemic was teaching online, because I am so dependent on being present with my students viscerally in a brick and mortar institution, in a classroom setting, for example, to read the class, to have this kind of back and forth engagement. That's my preference. That's something that I love. And it seems to me, on my own experience now, going on a couple of years, as I continue to teach online, most of my classes are still online, though synchronous, using Zoom live. It's not the same. And of course, this goes to the truth that technology always does two things. It gives something, but it takes something away, right? That's what technology does. It affords a new something, but by virtue of that newness, there's something that's subtracted or threatened by means of a kind of subtraction. So personally, as a professor, as an educator, very difficult to navigate that, both my own learning curve, learning how to use the technology, and then articulate myself and engage with gauge the students mediated through a screen. That was like tough. Students themselves wrestling not only with the material through this new medium, but also existentially, psychologically, with the pandemic and the loss of lives that they had to deal with, and sickness and all of that, which speaks to the importance of a global education. That is to say, we want to create a society in which people are being informed, again, in the humanities, how to deal with crises, whether it's a pandemic or an epidemic, whether it's something else, where they have the resources to reflect on questions of mortality, of deep disruption, and all of that there. But again, if the educational system has failed, and of course we can ask, well, is that even the job of the educational system? Even though education happens in many different platforms in many different ways, if education is not providing this, then we're going to have a bigger problem, right? Than just people dying, right? Or getting sick. So these are some of the experiences that I've been having. Silver lining, yeah, I think so. And as far as it forces us to be innovative, forces us to be adaptive, those are good things. Growth happens through pain, through challenges, through difficulties. But it's been difficult as an educator, as somebody who's rolling that out.
Just kind of closing out this conversation about education and ignorance, for someone who is making that choice to take their self-education more seriously, or just having that paradigm shift about education and its role to living the good life, what are some practical resources or methods or mental models that you guys can kind of impart on the listener, things to consider and pursue in light of this conversation?
There's a quote that's misattributed to Aristotle, but it's a nice quote nevertheless, which goes something like this: the mark of an educated mind is the ability to entertain a thought without necessarily accepting it. That ability to entertain ideas and concepts and thoughts that may be at once alien to us or even threatening to us, that ability to entertain and to enter into dialogue rather than shouting matches, speaks to the kind of disposition I think we ought to have or cultivate in order to obtain, so that we can be lifelong learners. So we don't fall into this black hole of an isolated perspective, right? That requires us to be challenged. It requires, again, us to have the other, right? The dialogue and whatnot, right? That's something immediately that comes to mind when I think about that.
And you alluded to this, Lewis. The fastest way to being educated around a particular topic is to understand this framework or mental model. The more you can focus on the mental model or shifts that is occurring, the better off you'll be. It's like almost a meta education, right? It's like trying to understand the general logic around some of these things. And the clearest way to actually being equipped to do that is through philosophy, right? This is the original way of thinking about search for truth. I would actually ask folks to, go study something, whether it's through a book, Coursera, whatever it is, go back to ground zero and learn philosophy if you haven't. And if you have, continue to push. And I think it'll be important. But the other thing I would say is the faster you can understand what medium is educating you and what medium is propaganda, the better off you'll be, right? Just as me personally, I don't even listen to news anymore, right? I try to understand facts, right? To say, what's going on in the world, right? So as a leader, which is weird because, back in the days, the mark of a leader, CEO, and so on is that they would have the Wall Street Journal in front of them. They're, they're just digesting news. I think leaders today, understanding these polycrises that we've formed in, and then the power of the propaganda machine, has just decided enough is enough. And they're becoming more clear cut about the medium of information that they're digesting. That's one of the best ways to back on track on an educational process, because the propaganda process can take you awry, and it's very hard to course correct once that's happened.
Let me just jump in and also say this, perhaps as a closing statement on my end. Since, Edwin, you're encouraging folks to explore philosophy as a salient discipline for a proper orientation for lifelong learning and whatnot, one of the questions that is asked often in the academic world from students usually, but also from administrators, is like, well, what's the purpose of philosophy, right? What am I going to do with philosophy? And the question itself, and as valid as it may be, reveals a utilitarian approach to education, right? That is to say, to think of education purely as a tool, as a means to some other end. What am I going to do with philosophy? I try to reorient the question for those who come and ask me that question by putting it like this. The question rather should be put, what can philosophy do with you? Not so much what you can do with philosophy as a tool. And of course, it could be used in that sense, but what can it do with you? I think that's important. Going all the way back to Aristotle, for example, right? As he's thinking about epistemology and specifically education, he's thinking about differing domains of knowledge, and he'll speak of servile arts, right? The servile arts, things like engineering, let's say. Helpful, great, right? Amazing. Finances, excellent, right? Because they are servile in that they have an instrumental value. They're tools, useful to something else. They serve us in that capacity. When it comes to something like philosophy and the arts, it's a liberal art, where we get the word, right? Liberal, educational, liberal arts. Now, what does that mean? Liberal, free. So that means, in a certain sense, and this is what I say to my students usually when they come in to philosophy the first time, you guys signed up for the most useless class that you'll ever take, like the most useless. And they're like shocked, like, damn, this guy, like, oh, okay. Useless. Yes, useless because it's not a servile art, right? It's useless the same way looking into your beloved's eyes is useless. Useless like flying to Santorini to watch the sunrise is useless. Useless like going out to play basketball with your friends is useless, right? Useless precisely because it is the highest, because it is an invitation to enter into contemplation, to fully experience the higher and the deeper. That's the thing, right? And so we don't want to minimize the servile arts. We don't want to just say, to hell with engineering and sciences. No, we don't want to say that. But we want to recognize the proper context in which to think of these things. And I think that's really helpful.
Edwin and Joe, thank you guys so much for this conversation about education and ignorance. I look forward to many more conversations with you guys, whatever the subject and topic is. I feel like this conversation is kind of like a foundation of all future conversations as far as like educating ourselves, the mental models of figuring out new things and challenging and entertaining thoughts without necessarily accepting them. So thank you so much for all the knowledge that you guys shared.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Louis.